the news over the last few weeks has made evident that when discussing responsible tech or ethical tech or humane tech or public interest tech, we are not just talking about the technology itself. We're talking about the organizational and incentive structures that exist within the organizations that create it. Technology companies have played a decidedly mixed role in many of the crises that we find ourselves in at the moment, and the next generation of technology companies must do better. So how can founders and operators build organizations that have technology-enabled scale, but also center more societal considerations, that center equity, ethics, social responsibility, impact, and so on, that better center public in addition to commercial considerations? What does it mean to move away from a growth at all costs model at the organizational level? That's what we hope you gain insight into today as practitioners. We have remarkable speakers, founders, investors, tech and society experts who are leading this work that will share best practice with you. And with that, we are super lucky to welcome our opening keynote, Davida Herzl, the CEO of Aclima. Aclima is a purpose-driven technology company working to catalyze bold action that protects public health, reduces emissions, and advances environmental justice. When Davida raised her $40 million Series B last year, she chose to do something remarkable and noteworthy. She changed her legal structure from an S Corp to a PBC, or a public benefit corporation, which meant her fiduciary responsibility was no longer only to her shareholders, but to all of her stakeholders, a potentially incredibly important precedent 3 years removed from the CEO roundtable, and in my view, quietly one of the most important stories, not only in tech, but in all of the private sector from last year. So, Davida, welcome. It is so wonderful to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation today.
Well, maybe we can start. And first of all, you're coming from the Bay. Yes,
I am.
In the Bay Area?
Yeah, in the Bay, where there's an atmospheric river at the moment.
Oh,
a lot of rain in California.
Which I bet you could prove with some sort of fancy data visualization right now if we need it.
Right.
Well, maybe we can start with some definitions. So, first of all, what is a public benefit corporation? How does it function differently from a C Corp or an S Corp? Also, folks sometimes confuse public benefit corporations with the B Corp certification. Can you discuss some of those differences?
Yeah. So when we raised our $40 million Series B, we transitioned from a C Corp, which is the most commonly used structure in tech, to a public benefit corporation. And what that transition does is that it actually changes our legal charter. So B Corps, and that whole movement around B Corps has been a really important part of having the basis for and an understanding of how do you measure your mission alignment across your entire organization and your benefits and impacts. But it doesn't actually create any legal requirements. It's self-certification. What a PBC does is that it formally changes your legal charter. And it's not just about tech, but in general, in the corporate world, when it comes to the fiduciary of a board of directors, the primary fiduciary of that board is to shareholders and to profitability and to maximizing profit. And one of the big challenges for me when I started Aclima was that there wasn't, I wanted to start a business because business is the most powerful vehicle for delivering goods, services at scale, and to really be able to reach, massive populations and swaths of the world. Where there was a false dichotomy, though, is that you could either choose to incorporate as a C corporation or, an S corporation or a nonprofit. And so you literally have to choose when you're making that decision, right? Profit versus no profit, revenue generation and service of what, right? Mm. And so what the legal restructuring does and what that charter does when you transition to a PBC is it expands the fiduciary of the board to say not only are you accountable to your shareholders, you're also accountable to your stakeholders. And it's your job to maximize public benefit as you're delivering goods and services associated with your business mandate, right? And so that legal structure changes the conversation. It changes how you engage your board. It changes decision making in such a way that it's not just something that you're, when you say you're a mission-driven company and you're driven by values, it's actually now a legal requirement. It's it's a part of the process now that you really have to engage on at every single level of decision making. And I can talk, more as we talk about how we do that. But one of the greatest examples for how we did that, and we've taken very sort of, explicit steps, because we measure emissions at the hyperlocal level. Not only are we measuring air quality, we're also measuring social and environmental injustice, because we can see how that pollution is impacting communities of color in disproportionate ways. And so those that are most impacted by pollution become a really important stakeholder group for us. And so a few months after we announced our Series B, we announced an advisory board of environmental justice leaders who, as we're going into this next phase of growth, are advising us, helping us understand, helping us consider that critical group of stakeholders as one example, right, in our work. And there's a lot of other things that we've done, but that's one example of how we're actually delivering on that legal mandate now as a company and as a board.
So I think that is fascinating context. And in thinking about or in bringing into the decision-making process folks that aren't only your users, but folks that are maybe indirectly impacted, not even from your direct activities, but from your general range of business, and giving them a formal seat at the decision-making table is a fascinating precedent. And so it leads into, I think, a broader question I have around, it's in some ways it's easy to understand whether you're creating value for your shareholders. It's one metric.
Yes, correct.
It's much harder to understand whether you're creating value for your stakeholders, right? You have to first identify who your stakeholders are, then you have to articulate what value means for them. You have to think about measuring it on an ongoing basis. You have to have some sort of heuristic if those values come into conflict. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about measuring stakeholder value on an ongoing basis, what you do if some of that value, some of those values conflict? I'd be super curious.
Yeah, maybe I've come up with these sort of mental frameworks to sort of navigate, the decisions that we have to make every single day, right? I think as business founders, as tech founders, as investors, as, the business community has been the mantra has been, how do you create compounding profitability, compounding revenue, compounding interest? We've never actually had the conversation around how do you create compounding benefit? And so whenever when we're making a decision, when we're deploying into a new region, we always think about how can we maximize benefit? And it turns out, because of what we do and the way that we've integrated our mission into our work, that actually is always good for business, right? It's always good for the bottom line. It is our competitive advantage because there's nobody that does what we do in terms of thinking about not just the delivery of our services and how we do it, but how do we ensure that there's compounding benefits? So I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, we announced a partnership with Block Power. Donnell Baird is an incredible founder, and he has a company that invests in environmental justice and historically underinvested communities to do building decarbonization. So we announced a partnership with Donnell and with Block Power. So they do building decarbonization. They install community-owned Wi-Fi. And they're also the recipients of workforce development dollars in the city of New York to hire from communities that have been impacted by gun violence, to bring people into climate jobs, get them trained up, and find them permanent long-term employment in the climate tech space. We have always, so here in the Bay Area where we started and where we've done a lot of our work here in California, we've always run that, that program, a similar program here ourselves. We hire from the communities that are most impacted, for the jobs that are responsible for deploying the actual network and doing the data collection. And so in New York, we partnered with Donnell. And so Donnell is going to be helping us recruit from the same communities where we're doing the mapping, right, that are most impacted by pollution, bringing them into full-time employment with Aclima to run the environmental sensor network that is generating all of the data on local greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. And then when you think about, okay, what's that? You keep asking yourself this question, what's the additional benefit we can create on top of it? Compounding benefit. Well, then the other thing that we're doing is that we're working, and there's a lot of other work that's going to happen, but just in this particular instance, now working with Donnell to say, okay, we're going to use our data to identify which buildings need to be prioritized for decarbonization and filtration. Because what our data shows is that pollution varies block to block by up to 800%, and we can see precisely where the hotspots are. And so which buildings, which schools, which public housing facilities are being exposed to the highest levels of pollution. Those are buildings to prioritize for investment in decarbonization. And then he's going to go in and hire more people and train more people to go in and do that work. And so we're creating from one deployment, from expanding into one geography, all of this compounding benefit through really novel partnerships, through thinking about the way that we're delivering goods and services in this more holistic way to say, how do we put, because like I said, we can see this inequitable distribution of emissions and pollution. How do we put those people that are most impacted at the center of our work and then think about compounding benefit through that lens? So that's one example.
So, I think people have a tendency to think in binaries, right? As you alluded to earlier, there's this idea of for-profit, there's this idea of non-profit. And I think one of the things that's tricky and nuanced and important about what you're doing is you're threading a needle of sorts.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, you alluded to your focus on maximizing public benefit as a competitive advantage.
Correct.
Can you speak a bit more to how you view or how you think of kind of pursuing compounding benefit actually has business motivations?
Yeah, I mean, they're completely integrated. My ultimate mission as a founder. So, it's funny because before starting Aclima, I went to law school and was spent a lot of time thinking about what are the legal structures that we've put in place to write the rules of business. Sometimes we don't stand back and think, wait, who wrote these rules that things have to be this way, right? And so where I want to get to is to be able to say that actually every single dollar that we make is a reflection of our impact, right? That they're not disconnected, that you're not just measuring, okay, dollars over here and impact over here, that you can actually bring it together and say every single dollar translated into, all of this impact, and not that you're trying to make up for one versus the other, right? And that you're trying to compensate. And so, for us, for example, so what we do, like I shared, we measure all the criteria, pollutants. We measure greenhouse gases. We measure toxics. We do this at the block level, providing unprecedented transparency into emissions and their impact. When we go out and talk to customers, our primary customers are often governments. And there's a wave of climate legislation that is sweeping the country right now. And in order to make decisions about where to invest in electrification, where to target emissions reductions, they need data, they need information. And so that's this critical capability that we're bringing to the table. But, so our first vertical and major vertical has been the government sector. What our PBC charter has done is that it's brought us to mission parity with our government customers. Mm-hmm. We are more likely to get a contract. We're more likely to win business because they know that we're aligned with them in helping them deliver on their public benefit mandates. And so that has actually put us in an incredibly unique position as a provider of this really unique data, where not only are we a technology provider, but we're a technology provider that they can trust. it doesn't, there's, and all, with this data and this information, there are a lot of unknowns about what the future is going to look like as we, increase transparency on emissions to the degree that we're doing that. And so what that requires is a strong ethical center. And, governments manage for risk. They don't necessarily manage for opportunity, right? And so understanding that they're partnering with a technology vendor, with a partner that understands their considerations, and that is asking itself those really difficult ethical questions, is a really important part of winning business in this particular vertical. In the enterprise, it's the same. So it has been a competitive advantage, a differentiator. And founders that I talk to and new CEOs, I'm always challenging them to think about, what does your customer really need from you to be successful, right? It's not just the technology. It's not just the tool. And the more you invest in those customer relationships that way, we're a SaaS. We build hardware, we generate data, but we're a SaaS company. That translates into recurring revenue, right? And ARR. And so that's why, for us, it's really about getting to that point where every dollar is a measure of impact, and every business won is actually a reflection of how well we're doing in delivering on that mission.
I think this framing of mission parity with your customers is incredibly poignant. I think in addition to that being kind of naturally the case in the public sector, in this environment of kind of growing distrust around big tech,
yes,
it's probably increasingly true from like a consumer perspective as well.
Yeah.
I want to quickly shout out all the Cornell LLMs in the room. With a law degree, you can play a very important role in this work.
Absolutely.
Davida, thank you for being an inspiration in that regard. I want to pivot a little bit before we open it up to questions in about 10 or 15 minutes and talk about what this looked like from a practical perspective. Because I know it wasn't as simple as flicking a switch. So can you speak a little bit to what it actually took for you to have conversations with your shareholders, with your existing stakeholders about this decision? Can you talk a little bit about the process looked like itself?
Yeah. No, it was not easy. And we raised, there's like the pandemic part, raising money in pandemic part 1 versus raising money in pandemic part 2. We raised our Series B in chapter 1 of the pandemic when, capital markets were in a different place than they are right now. I think, investors were literally still trying to figure out how do I take pitches on Zoom, right? So it required a lot of conversations, and we made a really hard decision. When we did the transition, and I think actually, the pandemic made it that much more, and all of these converging crises that we were seeing made that moral imperative that much more, loud, right? And I think that backdrop of the pandemic created an environment for a conversation where I could really get my investors to understand why we were doing this in a way that maybe we wouldn't have been able to before. It's not to say, so we've been mission driven from the start, because we wouldn't have done this if we weren't. But what was clear was that we were going to grow. I was going to bring more board members, onto the board. That it wasn't just, the founders anymore, making these decisions, and that I saw sort of with the pandemic and, the acceleration of the climate crisis, that it was going to be critical that we have that long-term alignment. And so it was a hard decision because we needed the capital. Would I have preferred to move very fast and get it all done very quickly? Absolutely. But I was really thinking about my long-term self as a founder. You have to think about yourself and sort of, protect your future self, right? It is so hard when you're under all of these pressures to, deliver on for your team members on payroll, and all of the short-term pressures, especially during the pandemic, were so extreme. But that moral imperative, I think, was loud and clear. And it was clear as well for us what role our data could play in this growing wave of climate legislation and the demand for environmental justice that ended up becoming central to the Biden-Harris campaign, right? And that those voices after the George Floyd event really became central to a larger conversation in this country about social justice. So that required, and I have a large cap table because raising money, and the numbers, Lyel, less than 0.5% of venture capital goes to women of color. And so our fundraising history has not been linear or easy. And so it meant I had to have a lot of conversations with folks on the cap table, but really authentic and real conversations that deepened, I think, my relationship with our investors. And it was an incredible filter for who came into the round. And forced difficult conversations now instead of later. And a lot of people, I think, and I see this happening in diligence in general, right, in the investment environment that we're in right now. It's really important to ask those questions, especially in the kinds of companies that we're all building, which are solving really difficult social challenges, which are addressing, critical societal needs. There is so much we don't know about what we're going to face. We see things changing so quickly. And so I had a lot of conversations, and they enabled me to filter. There were investors that I didn't bring on because it didn't resonate. And that was a great tell for me. That was such a great test for us as we were thinking about who to bring along in our journey. And so, and in terms of like the diligence process, probably added about at least 30 minutes to an hour to every single investor conversation. Yeah. And, had to educate my board. And I started the education process, and it was, multiple phases. Susie McCormick, and the incredible lawyer who's largely responsible for the PBC framework in Delaware, educated our board, had other board, non-board members speak with our board, a lot of education, but it ended up being the best decision and best move that we could have made.
Super helpful. And I think this articulation of protecting your best self, your future self, is so powerful, because in this work in PBC and maybe some of the other things that we'll talk about over the course of the day, I think there's this idea that, we're making the case now, or you've made the case, that it's not a cost center, right, in the long run. Like, it can lead to a more holistic, robust business. However, in the short term, it often means putting up work up front. And to be in a place where you are thinking about your future self and keeping that in mind, I think, is really, really insightful and important.
And for our investors, I'll just say one thing, because I think it's critical. It was also about how did they think about risk, right? And I think that the backdrop of what was happening and has been happening with big tech, where they haven't been integrating stakeholders into their decision making and maximizing profitability, but not thinking through all of the public impacts of their technology, that creates a lot of risk for investors. And so this is a framework through which you manage risk over the long term. That shift was also really critical, because it wasn't just about like, oh, we're tacking on this, for a good thing. It's like, no, this is about running sustainable, long-term, strong businesses where you reduce those kinds of risks and have a framework for managing them.
It does seem to be increasingly, and hopefully continually increasingly true, that overlooking some of the things that you're talking about has greater liability associated with it, right? Like, the
Correct.
more you are not thinking through how you are impacting society at scale presents risk across a number of different vectors, and that it's something that has to be managed and cared for in an intentional way. So maybe one or two more questions before we open it up. So looking back, I guess you're just under a year into this process, right? Into this conversion. Has it been worth it so far? And if a founder is thinking about, let's say, converting or maybe incorporating in the first place as a PBC, what advice would you have?
Not only has it been worth it, I wish that I'd had the opportunity, because PBCs didn't become official until a few years ago as an option. I wish I could have started as a PBC day one. It has really been like I said, the most beneficial thing we could have done, and has really enabled us to integrate stakeholders into the decision-making process in a way that has actually translated to more business. And so not only has it been good for, I think, as a mission-driven company, having that authenticity of our DNA, the mission really being woven into every aspect of our DNA, from our legal charter to the way that we engage with each other as team members, but has actually driven up our revenue and our pipeline and our future potential in ways that are absolutely extraordinary. I'm just, it's enabling us to deliver on the dream that we had when we started the company, and to have that be like a real possibility now. So we have some big announcements coming up, but wouldn't have happened without that very intentional integration of our stakeholders.
So worth it is what you're saying.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
Very super interesting. And as far as well, maybe before we kind of dive into the advice piece of that, apart from maybe the upfront cost, or maybe if you could kind of speak to that, like, were there drawbacks? What were maybe some of the larger challenges associated with the conversion?
I think challenges in terms of time and, and the investment, and, always, it was a significant investment up front. And especially, I think, harder for more of an investment because because it was a transition. We didn't start out this way.
Got it.
The other thing was also, I think we updated our values, because I think in terms of how we talk about them internally within the company and how we express them, because this transition requires, and it's great, right? It's a great outcome, but it requires us having really difficult conversations sometimes internally as we're making decisions about which direction to go in with our technology, what to prioritize in terms of features. And so I think, integrating that decision-making process and the capacity to have those really hard conversations about the potential implications of going down one path or another, it's brought that forward, so that it's not something that you're thinking about sort of after the fact and after the consequences. It's central to the decision-making around what you prioritize. Is this meeting our mission PBC mandate? That's a hard transition, right? To create the framework for that. But again, entirely worth it. And it's a critical part of the process. It can't just be something you put on a legal charter. You have to integrate the values, the mechanisms by which you bring that charter sort of front and center into the conversations that your software and, product managers are having. That's a process.
That is fascinating. The idea that as a byproduct of the decision, your organization has been forced, and I think this is a very concrete takeaway for founders, to develop the capacity across the organization to have difficult conversations.
Correct.
Because the decisions are necessarily more complex. I think that's fascinating. And later over the course of the day, I think we'll have a bunch of other conversations about how maybe you can create the sort of environment that is conducive to having those difficult conversations. But I guess in addition to that, that insight, I guess I'll conclude with the advice. We'll revisit the advice question and conclude, and then open it up for questions from our audience. So, generally speaking, or in addition to any of the things that we've already covered, is there advice that you'd have for founders who are thinking about converting to a public benefit corporation or incorporating as one in the first place?
Yeah.
What do you wish you had known?
What I wish I had known was that I didn't have a playbook, right? There wasn't a playbook for, okay, you do the charter, you have to align your investors, you have to align your company, you have to align your culture, you have to create these frameworks for capacity. But I feel like, it's really clear what those steps are. Don't be afraid, because the outcomes, the benefit of doing this are so transformational, right? As human beings, we build tools. Technology is a tool. And if we aren't integrating frameworks for responsibility and accountability into how we build those tools, we're not going to deliver on the complete potential of technology to really benefit society. And so I think there is a new generation of founders that understands this really deeply, that understands that that the context in which we're operating right now as a society demands so much more from us. And it demands, I think, as well, community. And what I'm so excited about with this conversation is that there's people coming together, and that right now this is really, for me, the basis for the foundation of a movement that frankly isn't just for tech. It needs to translate across all of corporate America and the world to rethink how we do business on the planet, and to think about that compounding benefit challenge rather than just compounding profit. And I think in the end, we will all be better for it.
Thank you for that, Davida. Brilliant. I'm seeing snaps and applause virtually. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. We have maybe just under 15 minutes. I'm seeing some in the chat, but before I go to the chat, we actually have about, I think, 50 people here live at BetaWorks. And so Roxanne and team in the library, are there any questions live at BetaWorks?
We're looking around the room. Who wants to ask a question? I know there's some stuff bubbling up. I saw people's laptops and notebooks out. If you have a question, you can come up and say it here so everybody in the metaverse can see you. But if you don't want to, you can say it out loud as well, and I can repeat it for you. Would you like to come up?
Sure.
Great.
Hi, my name is Steven.
Can you go in front? Oh, hey, Steven. Hey, there you are in front of the mic. Hey, Steven. It's true, everyone online. There actually is a room full of people listening to the same conversation that you're listening to at beautiful BetaWorks Studios here on Little West 12 in New York City. Go for it, Steven. Thank you.
This is awesome to hear. I guess I'm just curious as to how you figure out what your stakeholders look like, what qualities they have, and who they are, and then how you engage with them, because I imagine they are a larger bunch of people than a board or any other entity that you're dealing with. So how do you kind of decide who they are and how to best talk with them and have that discussion?
Yeah. So for us, and I think it's really important to think about not only who is your technology or your product or your service going to benefit, but who is potentially impacted by your technology and product, right? And so I think that, and it's not necessarily us. We don't define the stakeholders, right? The stakeholders sort of define themselves through that process. And so that's a first challenge, and I think we can all do that. I've done some of this work with other founders who are thinking through this kind of transition, and I think we can all identify, again, not just the beneficiaries, but who's going to be impacted, and so creating a mechanism for having an ongoing conversation with those folks. And your stakeholders might change over time, because that stakeholder conversation forces the product and technology to evolve. But we have an advisory board. It's growing. So, and within that advisory board, we will set up, okay, we have, like I said earlier, we have some really difficult decisions to make in terms of direction of technology and prioritization of features and which direction we go. We will create sort of gatherings of subsets of that advisory board to meet with us, and we'll give them 3 questions, and we'll say, we're really struggling with these 3 things. Tension between, one path or another. Can you help us think it through? Not necessarily have the answers, but sometimes it's just about helping us further understand the impacts so that we have more data with which to make those decisions. And so advisory boards are a great way to do that. Informal engagements, we do informal engagements with environmental justice communities where we're mapping to understand what are those local issues that we need to have front and center as we're deploying in a new region. In our case, what does that mean? It means that we need to better understand what are the concerns from a pollution impact perspective from those community members that are, seeing the highest rates of asthma or, other implications from pollution. So we do both that formal engagement and informal. And we have our advisors, sign up for that, it's a 2-year term, and they commit to that process we also give them options in the company so that they are invested in our success, and we are truly aligned. So it's not just, and a no compensation, sort of no the formal arrangement has that embedded in it. So again, it's about finding all of those ways to align through both formal and informal processes.
Thanks so much for that question, Stephen. So before maybe we take another question from BetaWorks, I want to visit some of the comments and questions that are coming up on Around the World. I see a bunch of folks have asked questions. Thank you, Elizabeth, Antonio, Betsy, Michael, Reshma, Diana for engaging. I want to pull out Reshma's because I think, Davida, you can speak to this, and it kind of goes into this like incentive alignment and PBC as a competitive advantage conversation. How, Reshma, Reshma, forgive me if hopefully I get your name right, Reshma Rogwani, the founder and CEO, is the founder and CEO, and she asks, how has your PBC status affected your hiring in a very tight labor market?
So it is a very tight labor market. I think for us, and it's not just it's always our mission, and our transition to PBC has always been a benefit when we're hiring. Right, we're competing with other big companies, folks that are often paying a lot more than we can, but really smart people want to work on really hard problems, and they want to have these really hard conversations. They don't, and to be challenged, not through just the lens of, and I'm speaking here about technology and engineering hires, which are some of the hardest right now. But it also enables us to bring in people that are deeply mission aligned day one. So once again, right, it's like engaging with investors and using that PBC as a filter. It enables us to bring in people that are mission aligned, that want to solve hard problems, and increases retention over time. So we have, very high rates of retention, and enables us to attract talent. It's again a competitive advantage.
Thanks for that question, Reshma. Are there other questions live at BetaWorks? I promise you. Yeah. Okay.
We've got some hands up.
Great.
This is a warm computer with love to hear all of your burning questions. So come on up. Yeah.
I wish you could see everyone.
Hi there.
Hi. I have a question about your investors. You mentioned your, I think you said large cap table. And the people that you're drawing from, obviously there's the filter that goes on in conversations, the extra half an hour you talked about to make sure that you're aligned. But finding the pool must be very different. And are any of your investors, or what percentage of your investors are VCs who invest in things that are not PBCs? And how are you finding the people that you're finding? Are there?
And sorry, quickly, can you just share your name and affiliation?
I'm Michael Grossman from Factor.
It's nice to see you again, Michael. Thanks for that great question. Yeah. Go for it.
So what's really cool about our cap table is that it includes corporate VC. I mean, we have Microsoft, we have Bosch, we have major energy company from Southeast Asia on the cap table. We have institutional investors like Social Capital, Chamath Palihapitiya and Jay Zaveri. We've got impact investors like the Schmidt Family Foundation, Emerson, Radical Impact. And so, it is hard. But one of the things that I've found is that I think there's a growing understanding of how important this is. People kind of want to, I don't know. I found this. People wanted to be nudged. They wanted to have that conversation. And frankly, some of the feedback that I got from those dialogues was like, oh, thank you so much for talking to me about this. I wish more founders would talk to me about these questions instead of pretending that glossing over, because that's what a lot of founders do that when they pitch. It's like you just show the shiny stuff. You don't have the hard dialogues up front with investors. And so I think that there's this latent desire in the industry, not just the impact and sort of, community, to have these harder conversations and to shift how they're thinking about that model. But it hasn't been easy. But I think I see things changing, which is great.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. So maybe we'll do one more question from. We'll take it from our virtual audience now. I see Angel, who's a student, has asked, and Davida spoke to this a little bit, but I think it digs into something super interesting. How do you think about building relationships between your stakeholders?
So that's a great question, because there is so much that comes from that cross-pollination, right? So we're actually setting up an advisory board meeting right now where we're going to have EJ leaders from across the country, and we're bringing in some institutional investors into that conversation who've never had these kinds of dialogues before.
EJ
right?
is in environmental justice.
Yes, EJ, environmental justice leaders from across the country. And so, being able to have investors not just listen to me or sort of read this in an article, but hear directly from those stakeholders, it changes everything. And so I think creating opportunities for that cross-pollination is huge, because there's so much that comes out of that process. And so, yes, we intentionally do try to get people in the room. We talk about sort of getting the system in the room and having maybe not everybody, but representatives of those different stakeholders in those conversations. It's super important.
Fascinating. So we're nearly at time, and I just want to reiterate, I think this is quietly one of the most important stories, not just in tech, but in all of the private sector from last year. Our brilliant MC, Roxanne Stafford, speaks often of the importance of narrative, of the narratives that we've come to accept sometimes without realizing it. And one of those narratives, certainly, is that the purpose of a corporation should be to solely create value for its shareholders, or shareholder primacy. And it's not some a priori rule, of course. It just goes back a couple of decades to the Chicago School of Economics. And I think, Davida, to your point, interestingly, we seem to be at this moment where even major business leaders have recognized the shortcomings of this model. And I'll allude, I think, notably to, in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is a collection of CEOs of a number of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world, actually said that the purpose of a corporation should be to its stakeholders. Alex Gorosky, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, and Jamie Dimon both asserted this. But the rub, of course, is that their legal structures still bind them to creating fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And so I think a number of folks have kind of thrown their hands up at the prospect of serious change. And this is why I think your action and your precedent is potentially so important. You're not a public company, but you're a mature company, and for you to actually change your legal structure and develop the infrastructure that you're developing is incredibly inspiring and important. And we're so grateful for you to spend the morning with us, 8 a.m. out in the Bay, and kick off our Responsible Tech Founder Summit. So if we could have a virtual round of applause for Davida and a round of applause in person. Hopefully, I want to hear you guys. Can we unmute so we can hear the round of applause in person? Because that was a wonderful, brilliant conversation.
Thank you.
And hopefully it won't be the last time we touch base. So while maybe someone unmutes in person so people can applaud so you can hear, I'm seeing tons of virtual love, which is awesome. Yeah, there we go. See? I told you there's people there. I told you there are people.
I believe you. I believe you now.
Yeah,
it's awesome to chat with you, Lyel, and to have the conversation. I hope that there's a lot more. And congrats on launching the summit. Super important.
So appreciate you, and can't wait to chat again soon about other things. So so for everyone else, some logistical points. So for next up at 12:10, we have 2 amazing panels. First of all, we have Finding Values Aligned Investors with Ope Bukola, Gabe Kleinman, Claire Charal, and Lindsay Siegel. And if you are here with us at BetaWorks, that will be in the library where you are right now. It will be broadcast there. If you're joining us virtually, you just hop into the room and run the world. And then we have another panel with Chapman Snowden, the CEO of Brick, Rhonda Allen, the CEO of DevColor, and Arthur Woods, who is one of the founders of Matheson. And I will be moderating that, and we'll be broadcasting that downstairs in camp if you're joining us here at BetaWorks, starting at 12:10. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so excited to kick off this day with you. I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Davida as much as I did.